the night of October 11, 1980, a 25-year-old mother vanished into the Kentucky dark. No blood, no body, no goodbye, just a woman who was there one moment and gone the next. And for over 20 years, the truth belonged to only one man, the man who drove off into the dark and never looked back. This is the story of Marlene Major, a young mother who loved her children more than anything in the world, a woman who knew she was in danger, a woman who tried to get out, and a woman whose murder would stay buried for 2 decades, until the little girl she left behind refused to let it stay that way. 26 years before that dark October night, in the winter of 1954, Helen Marlene Oakes was born in Lincoln County, Kentucky, one of 7 children raised by Billy and Lorraine Oakes. People who knew her said she was warm, bubbly, the kind of person who made everyone around her feel at ease. Around town, people just called her Blondie because of the long golden hair that fell straight down to her waist. She seemed like a girl who had everything ahead of her. And then, when she was just 16 years old, she met Bill Major. Bill was 26, 10 years older, dark-haired, sharp-eyed. His own father would later describe him as a natural charmer, someone who could talk the pants off anybody. But his father always added one thing after that. You couldn't believe a word he said. Marlene didn't know that yet. Bill was attentive. He called her. He showed up. He made a teenage girl feel like the most important person in the room, and within a few years, the two were married. They settled in Verona, Kentucky, a small trailer off the highway. Bill opened his own auto repair shop right off the interstate, called it B&B Automotive. The B&B stood for Bill and Blondie. They had a son named Donald, then a daughter named Lalana. Verona, 1980. It was the kind of place where you left your back door unlocked and trusted your neighbors completely. Everyone knew everyone. No one asked too many questions. And in a town that small, a happy-looking family in a roadside trailer raised absolutely no suspicion. That small-town trust became the perfect shield for a monster. By 1980, whatever warmth had once existed between Marlene and Bill was long gone. The marriage had been falling apart for years. They fought constantly, loud, ugly arguments that filled their small trailer and spilled into the night. Neighbors heard it. And one man, more than anyone else, had a front-row seat to all of it. That man was Glenn St. Hilaire. In the spring of 1980, Glenn was a young welder driving from Ohio to Texas looking for work. He had French-Canadian roots, a beat-up camper van, and no plan whatsoever because somewhere on the highway near Verona, his engine died. He called the only auto shop nearby, B&B Automotive. Bill Major came out, fixed the van, and by the end of that evening, the two men were out getting beers together. Bill liked Glenn immediately. Before the night was over, he had offered Glenn a place to park his camper right on their property. No rush. Stay as long as you need. Glenn said yes. What started as a one-night stop turned into something no one expected. Glenn ate meals with the family. He helped around the property. The children took to him right away, and Marlene, who was starving for warmth in a marriage that had gone completely cold, found in Glenn someone she could actually trust. But then Bill started doing something strange. He began pushing the two of them together. He created situations where Marlene and Glenn were alone, without him. And then, on one particularly hot summer night, Bill crossed a line that made Glenn's skin crawl. He suggested that Glenn sleep in the bed with Marlene, not beside the bed, in it. The room was suffocating. Glenn refused, but the psychological chess match had already begun. It made no sense at the time, a husband practically handing his wife to another man. But investigators would later understand exactly what Bill was doing. He wanted Glenn close to Marlene. He wanted the affair to happen, because a wife wrapped up in a new relationship asked fewer questions about what was happening behind closed doors. And a man living on your property made for a very convenient suspect if anything ever went wrong. Over the following weeks, Marlene and Glenn did fall in love, quietly, desperately. The way it happens when two people find each other inside a nightmare. Marlene told Glenn things she had never told her own sisters. She trusted him completely. She even handed him a stack of her private diaries to keep safe. It wasn't a romantic gesture, it was insurance. She told him plainly, if I disappear, give these to the police. No drama, no tears, just a calm, quiet instruction from a woman who had already thought through what her husband might do to her. She knew exactly what he was capable of. By October 1980, Marlene had made her decision. She was leaving Bill. She had told her sister. She had told Glenn. She had a plan, and she had proof of something so serious that she was certain no judge in Kentucky would ever rule in Bill's favor. But Bill found out. The night of October 11th started quietly and ended like a thunderclap. Glenn heard the fight from outside. He had heard them argue before, but this one was different, louder, more vicious. Something in the air felt wrong, like the pressure before a storm breaks. So he did what he always did. He walked to a nearby diner, sat down with a cup of coffee, and waited for things to cool down. He was gone for a couple of hours. When he came back, the trailer was in complete disarray. Drawers had been ripped open. Clothes were scattered across the floor. The house was completely silent. Marlene was gone. And then, from the shadows inside the trailer, Bill Major stepped out. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "She left," Bill said. "Took the kids and ran. I don't know where she went." Glenn wanted to believe him. The marriage was broken. Marlene wanted out. Maybe she had finally had enough. Maybe this was it. But the very next morning, Glenn was walking near a neighbor's house when he stopped dead in his tracks. Through the window, he saw Marlene's children. They were there, safe, with the neighbor. Bill hadn't lost them at all. He had quietly dropped them off himself. Before the argument had even finished, before Glenn had ever come back from the diner, he had lied, straight to Glenn's face, without a single crack in his voice. And in that moment, everything Glenn thought he knew flipped completely upside down. Because there was one thing he knew about Marlene with absolute certainty. One thing no argument, no matter how bad, could ever change. Marlene would never leave without her children. Not voluntarily. Not for any reason on earth. Which meant she hadn't run. Which meant something had happened to her. Hours later, Glenn St. Hilaire walked into the Boone County Police Station. He placed Marlene's diaries on the detective's desk, and he told the officer on duty that Bill Major had just murdered his wife. But Glenn didn't realize something in that moment. By walking into that station, he had just put a target on his own back. To the detectives, Glenn wasn't just a grieving friend with information. He was the boyfriend. And in a murder case with no body, no blood, no crime scene, the boyfriend is always the perfect suspect. The investigation was about to begin. But before it could go anywhere, detectives had a choice to make, and the wrong choice was going to let a killer walk free for the next 20 years. That same day, Bill Major walked into the station. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't red-eyed from crying. He came in calm, composed, and completely in control, the way a man walks in when he has already rehearsed everything he's going to say. His story was simple, clean, almost too clean. Marlene had been unhappy for a long time. The marriage was struggling. And then Glenn showed up and Marlene fell for him. Bill said he had even encouraged Marlene to spend time with Glenn, hoping it would pass. But it didn't. On the night of October 11th, Marlene had finally made her choice. She got into her car and drove away. Bill looked the detective in the eye and said he hadn't seen her since. 2 men, 2 rooms, 2 completely different realities, and in the middle, a frustrated detective with absolutely no physical evidence to prove who was lying. The case was dead on arrival, until they broke the seal on Marlene's diaries. The detective sat down and started reading. What he found wasn't a story about an affair. It wasn't the diary of a woman running away from her marriage. It was the diary of a woman living in silent terror. Marlene had written about what she saw one morning when she went to wake her son Donald for school. She walked into the room. And she caught Bill, right there compromising the safety of their 8-year-old boy. In her own words, she wrote, "I know what I saw. I told him never to touch again, and if he ever harms Donald again, I'll ensure he faces justice." She wrote that Donald had told her this had been happening for 4 to 5 years. 4 to 5 years. Donald was 8 years old. Marlene wasn't just leaving because the marriage was broken. She was leaving because she had witnessed her husband do something to her child that she could never unsee, never forgive, and never allow to continue. She had written down everything as evidence, because she knew that in a divorce she would need proof. She wrote, "I could be the worst woman in Verona, and no judge would dare give him my children before me." She was building a case, quietly, carefully, from inside the trap. And then, the detective found something else buried deeper in the file, something that made the whole picture even darker. Bill Major had a 1975 conviction in a neighboring county for severe boundary violations against minors. It had been reduced to a misdemeanor. He had been ordered into counseling. And then the record quietly gathered dust. Marlene had found out. She had followed Bill to his court-ordered sessions without him knowing. She had pulled the court documents herself. She had written every detail down. She knew exactly who she had married. She had spent years quietly collecting the proof she needed to escape. And she had told her sisters what she knew, that Bill was dangerous, that she had evidence, that she was leaving. The detective closed the diary. He sat with what he had just read for a long moment. Then came the words that would haunt this case for the next 2 decades. It's hearsay. We can't use it. In a court of law, a diary is one person's private account, written alone, with no witness, no cross-examination. What Marlene had written about what she saw, what Donald had told her, what Bill had done, none of it could anchor a murder charge. Even what she had told her sisters, her fears, her plans, her proof, was deemed inadmissible without a body to confirm a crime had even taken place. What she told her family, what she left in those pages, all of it hearsay. Without a body, there was no crime. The detectives had a diary full of motive. They had 2 men with contradicting stories. They had a missing woman with no car, no money, no ID, and no trace. Legally, their hands were tied, and Bill knew it. When detectives asked him to take a polygraph test, he didn't flinch. He simply refused. And within days, he began erasing his life in Kentucky completely. He handed his firearms to his neighbor Bryce for almost nothing. He sold his tractor. He quietly liquidated everything he had. Then he packed his children's things and put them on a plane to Rhode Island. He told them they were going to visit family. They never went home. A few days later, Bill arrived in Rhode Island without Marlene. Lalana was 4 years old. Donald was 8, and their father sat them down and gave them the only version of their mother they would know for the next decade. He told them she was a drug addict, an alcoholic, a woman who had chosen another man over her own children. He said she didn't love them, that she was never coming back. Lalana didn't fully understand what any of it meant, but she understood one thing. Her mother was gone, and the man sitting in front of her was all that was left. Back in Kentucky, the investigation slowed, then stalled, then stopped. The case went cold. Somewhere deep in the cold Kentucky soil, the truth was already buried. And the man who put it there had just walked away clean. He had crossed state lines. He was starting a new life, and he was now raising the only 2 eyewitnesses to his darkness. For 20 years, the file gathered dust. For 20 years, Bill's lie was the only truth his children knew. Until the 4-year-old girl he carried onto that plane grew up. Lalana Major was about to look into her mother's past, and she was ready to dig up everything her father had buried. Rhode Island looked nothing like Kentucky. Different streets, different skies, different neighbors who didn't know their names yet. For 4-year-old Lalana and 8-year-old Donald, everything was unfamiliar. The schools, the cold, the fast-talking strangers with accents that felt nothing like the slow drawl of Verona. But one thing had followed them across every state line. Their father, Bill, settled the family in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, bought a trailer, enrolled the kids in school, and within a year married a woman named Pauline. From the outside, it looked like a man rebuilding his life after a difficult divorce. A fresh start. A blended family trying to find its footing. That was the story Bill told the world. Inside that trailer, the story was something else entirely. The abuse didn't start slowly. It was already there, carried in like luggage from Kentucky, and it got worse with every passing month. Bill's rages were unpredictable. Calm one minute, explosive the next, for no reason anyone could see coming. The children learned to read the air in a room the moment they walked in. The way he was sitting, whether his jaw was tight, they learned to move quietly, speak carefully, and disappear when the temperature dropped. But disappearing wasn't always possible. Bill subjected Donald to such extreme physical rages on some occasions that the boy was left physically incapacitated on the floor. Lalana would go to school in long sleeves in the summer, not because she was cold, but because the bruises underneath couldn't be explained, and the physical violence was only the surface. Bill had a favorite method of control. He would pull one child aside and make it clear that any disobedience would mean severe, life-threatening consequences for their sibling. Then he would pull the other one aside and play the exact same psychological game in reverse. He turned their love for each other into a weapon. He made them complicit in their own silence, because speaking up didn't just mean danger for themselves. It meant putting the person they loved most directly in harm's way. They stayed quiet, because in the back of both their minds sat a thought neither of them ever said out loud. Their mother had disappeared. Their father was the last person who had seen her alive. If he could make a grown woman vanish without a trace, what would he do to a child who talked? Bill also had a system at work. He had parked a recreational vehicle on his employer's property, an RV tucked away from the main building, away from eyes and questions. Each day he would bring one child with him, and at some point during that day he would take them into that RV. To his coworkers, he was just a hard-working father who liked spending time with his kids. The RV looked like a lunch spot, a place to rest. It was the place where the worst things happened. Donald and Lalana never discussed it with each other directly. They didn't need to. They both knew. and that shared, unspoken knowledge became the invisible thread that held them together, warning glances across a room, hovering for each other's absences, making sure neither one was ever completely alone with him if they could help it. They were each other's only protection in a house where no real protection existed. Pauline was not a cruel woman. She was genuinely kind to the children, warmer than anyone else in their lives at that point. She noticed the bruises. She asked questions. She paid attention in ways that Bill worked constantly to prevent. And one day, Lalana broke. She wrote everything she could bring herself to put into words. The rages, the screaming, the violence that filled their nights, and left it on the kitchen table in a letter addressed to Pauline. Pauline read it, and then she did something no one in that house had ever done. She confronted Bill directly. Bill didn't get angry. He didn't threaten her. He collapsed, he sat down, and he cried. The kind of crying that makes a person look small and broken and harmless. He told Pauline he knew he had a problem. He promised her, hands shaking, voice cracking, that it would never happen again, that he would get help, that he was a changed man. Pauline believed him. She walked to the kitchen sink and burned the letter. She thought she was saving her family. He had no idea she was sealing them back inside the nightmare. The very next time Bill was alone with Lalana, he grabbed her. He pushed her against the wall. He brandished a weapon directly at her and looked her in the eyes with an expression she would describe years later as the coldest thing she had ever seen. "If you ever say anything to anyone again," he said, "you won't live to regret it." Lalana stood completely still. She didn't scream. She absorbed every word. And then she went silent for years. By 1984, Donald was 12 years old. He had been carrying this weight his entire life. And somewhere that year, something inside him reached its absolute limit. He had watched his sister get a gun pressed to her face for writing a letter about screaming and bruises. He knew that what Lalana had written was only the surface. He knew what was really happening. Inside that trailer, inside that RV at work, in every hidden corner of their lives, he went to Pauline. Not with a letter about bad tempers, not with carefully chosen words designed to soften the blow. He told her the full, unspoken truth. The truth about what his father was doing to him inside that RV. The truth that went far beyond rages and bruises. This time, Pauline didn't cry. She didn't sit down with Bill. She didn't give him a chance to speak. She walked straight to the phone and called the police. August 10th, 1984. Police cars pulled up to the house with lights flashing. Officers moved quickly. Bill Major was inside, and within minutes he was against the wall with his hands being pulled behind his back. Lalana and Donald stood at the end of the hallway and watched. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Bill turned his head. He looked directly down that hallway at his children. His face was completely still. No anger, no panic, no expression at all. Just a long, cold, deliberate stare. Lalana felt her stomach drop, because she had seen that look before. It wasn't the face of a man who had been caught. It was the face of a man making a promise. If he gets out, she thought, we're dead. Bill Major was sentenced to 15 years in a Rhode Island state prison. Donald and Lalana were sent back to Kentucky, to Verona, to the home of their maternal grandmother, Lorraine Oakes, Marlene's mother. For the first time in their lives, they were safe. But safety has a way of making room for the questions that fear had always pushed aside. Lalana was 9 years old, sitting in a house full of people who finally loved her, and all she could think about was her mother, not the version her father had described, not the drug addict who didn't love her children, the real one, the one from before, the one with the long golden hair. And the question that had been growing quietly inside her since she was 4 years old was finally loud enough to hear. If my father could do all of this, for years, without anyone stopping him, what exactly did he do to her that night? That question was about to take over Lalana's entire life, and the answer she was going to find, buried in a cold case file that hadn't been touched in over a decade, was going to be worse than anything she had imagined. If you're standing with Lalana on this journey to uncover the truth, take a moment to subscribe and support this channel. Because what comes next is the part that changes everything. Nobody said her name. That was the thing Lalana noticed first. Back in Verona, in her grandmother Lorraine's house, surrounded by family for the first time in years, nobody said Marlene's name. There was a photograph on the living room wall, a young woman with short, curly hair. Lalana stared at it for days before she realized who it was. She didn't recognize her own mother. The Marlene she remembered had long golden hair that fell straight down to her waist. The woman in that photograph was someone else entirely. Someone who had existed before Lalana was old enough to remember. Someone the adults in the house carried quietly, like a wound that never closed, present in every room, mentioned in none. At school, kids knew. Small towns always know. Lalana was the girl whose mother had run away, left her kids, chose a man over her own family. That was the story Bill had planted, and it had grown roots even here, even in Marlene's own hometown. Lalana sat in classrooms and hallways and absorbed the whispers, and every time someone repeated her father's version of events, something hardened inside her. She didn't believe it. She had never believed it. But belief without proof is just stubbornness. The countdown started the moment Bill was sentenced. 15 years. That was what the Rhode Island court had given him. 15 years, which meant he would be out before Lalana finished growing up. She did the math constantly, the way children do when they're afraid. She tracked the years like a prisoner tracks days. Every birthday that passed was 1 year closer to the moment Bill Major walked back out into the world. And she knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had looked into his eyes in that hallway, that when he got out, he would come looking for them. The only thing that could stop that from happening was the truth about Marlene. If Bill could be charged with murder, he would never be free again. But to charge him with murder, someone had to prove one had taken place. And the only person who seemed willing to do that work was a teenage girl in her grandmother's house in Verona, Kentucky, with no legal training, no resources, and no allies. So she bought a composition notebook, 99 cents at Walmart, and she started writing everything down. Every conversation she had, every name she heard, every date she could remember. She interviewed neighbors, family members, anyone who had known Marlene. She wrote down the time and date of every single conversation. She documented everything because she had watched the system ignore her mother once already, and she was not going to give it a reason to ignore her again. In 1996, the countdown ended. Bill Major walked out of prison after serving 11 years of his 15-year sentence. A stroke in 1995 had accelerated his release on medical grounds. He was a free man. Lalana was 20 years old, and she was terrified. Not the paralyzing fear of childhood, but a cold, focused kind of terror that made her move faster instead of freezing. Because Bill being free meant the window was closing. It meant that if something wasn't done soon, he would disappear into a new life, a new state, a new wife, a new identity, and Marlene's case would never be touched again. Lalana picked up the phone and called her father. She made him an offer. She told him she wasn't interested in prosecution. She said she just wanted to bury her mother. That was all. Just tell her where the body was, and she would leave him alone. She would let him live his life, she promised. Bill listened to the whole thing, and then he laughed, not nervously, not uncomfortably. He laughed the way someone laughs when they hear a joke that isn't very good. Then he said, "If you think I'm going to tell you where your mother's body is, you're crazy." Lalana didn't say much after that. She hung up the phone, and she sat with what had just happened for a long moment. He hadn't denied it. He hadn't said, "There is no body." He hadn't said, "I don't know what you're talking about." He had answered a question about a body's location, which meant he knew exactly where it was. Lalana opened her composition notebook and wrote the date at the top of a new page. Okay, she thought. It's on. She went to the Boone County Sheriff's Department and asked for the case file on Marlene Major. The response she got was a masterclass in institutional indifference. The case was old. The files might be archived. It had been classified as a missing person case, not a homicide. There was no active investigation. Come back later. Call this number. Fill out this form. Lalana came back. She called. She filled out the forms. She showed up again. And again, became the person the front desk recognized. The young woman with the notebook who kept asking about the same cold case from 1980. Some officers were dismissive. Some were annoyed. A few were quietly impressed by her persistence even if they didn't say so. Eventually, after enough time and enough returned visits, the file appeared. It was thinner than she expected. Yellowed pages, faded ink, evidence of a case that had been opened, poked at briefly, and then quietly set aside. Lalana sat down with it and started reading, and within the first few pages, she understood something that made her stomach turn. The 1980 investigation had been shallow. Police had accepted Bill's story about Marlene leaving far too easily. The search of the property had been cursory. The diary, the one Glenn had handed over on day one, had been cataloged, deemed legally insufficient, and shelved within days. Nobody had pushed back. Nobody had asked the harder questions. And Bill had walked away from Kentucky within a week of his wife's disappearance because nobody had stopped him. But then Lalana turned to a section near the back of the file that she hadn't known existed. November 29th, 1981. Hunter on a farm approximately 1 mile from the major property had found a partial human skull. Female, Caucasian, late 20s, with clear signs of trauma to the upper structure. The remains had been heavily altered. Crucial identifying features and dental records were entirely missing from the skull. Lalana sat completely still. She read the page again and again. The skull had been sent to a lab. It had sat there, unidentified, unclaimed, untested, for nearly 2 decades. because in 1981, without teeth and without DNA technology, there was no way to confirm who it belonged to. But Marlene had a daughter, and daughters share their mother's DNA. There was one piece of evidence that had been sitting in that lab since 1981, forgotten, dusty, waiting, and it had been less than a mile from where Marlene was last seen alive. Lalana closed the file. Her hands were not shaking. Her voice, if she had spoken, would have been steady. She had just found the thread that was going to unravel everything. Now she had to pull it. Lalana walked out of that sheriff's department with the file under her arm, and one thought locked in her mind. That skull was her mother. She couldn't prove it yet, but she knew, the way you know things that live in your body before they live in your head. A partial skull, female, late 20s. Found 1 mile from the house where Marlene Major was last seen alive. Jawless, toothless, with a bullet hole in the top. The person who had done that to the remains, who had taken the time to systematically erase any dental records or structural identifiers, had done it for one reason. It had worked for 20 years. Lalana was about to try to make it stop working. She started researching, reading, asking questions of anyone who would answer them, and somewhere in that process, she came across something that had only recently become possible in forensic science: mitochondrial DNA testing. The science is straightforward once you understand it. Inside every human cell are tiny structures called mitochondria. They carry their own separate strand of DNA. And unlike regular DNA, which comes from both parents, mitochondrial DNA passes only from mother to child, unchanged, direct, generation to generation, which meant that if that skull belonged to Marlene Major, its mitochondrial DNA would match Lalana's. All it required was a bone sample from the skull and a swab from the inside of Lalana's cheek. The problem was the cost. $20,000. For a family in Verona, Kentucky, that was not a number you simply found lying around. Lalana started making calls to family members, to anyone who might be willing to contribute. Marlene's sister stepped forward and offered something that stopped everyone in the room. She said she would cash out her retirement fund, her entire retirement. Every dollar she had saved over decades of working, she would hand it over to test a skull. That is what this family was willing to sacrifice for Marlene. It never came to that. At the last possible moment, the state of Kentucky agreed to cover the cost. The test would be funded, the sample would be taken, and after 20 years of silence, the skull in that forensic lab was finally going to have a chance to speak. But before the DNA results could mean anything, the skull needed to be formally examined. That job went to forensic anthropologist Dr. Emily Craig. Craig laid out the remains and went through them with the kind of careful, methodical attention that turns bone fragments into evidence. What she found was not just a cause of death, it was a record of deliberate, calculated violence. There was evidence of catastrophic trauma. The analysis indicated that Marlene had sustained fatal injuries from a firearm at close range, with multiple impacts confirming an intentional act. But the gunshot was only the beginning. Along the neck bones, Dr. Conshot, Craig found a series of straight, parallel marks, evenly spaced, running in a clean horizontal line. The markings indicated the use of a sharp, heavy tool. It was clear evidence of a calculated attempt to permanently compromise and conceal the remains. And then there was the jaw. The structural damage to the remains was highly specific. Dr. Craig found fine, precise markings along the bone joints. These markings were left by a sharp blade used intentionally to dismantle the structure of the skull. The individual responsible knew exactly how to navigate the anatomy, working methodically until the features were completely separated. This was not the work of someone who had lost control. This was the work of someone who had planned. Dr. Craig's conclusion was unambiguous. The manner of death was homicide. Then the DNA results came back. The lab called. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from the skull's bone tissue was compared against the sample taken from Lalana. The result was a maternal match. The skull belonged to a direct maternal relative of Lalana Bramble. It was Marlene. Lalana got the call and sat with it for a long time. Later, she would describe that moment in 3 words. 110% she's gone. No hope, no coming back, no chance that somewhere out there Marlene had made a new life and simply chosen not to return. The last small corner of uncertainty, the one Lalana had probably never fully admitted, was still there, closed permanently. Her mother had been murdered, and now the state of Kentucky had the evidence to prove it. Marlene Major's case was officially reclassified, no longer a missing person, no longer a cold case, a homicide. Commonwealth Attorney Linda Talley Smith had been watching Lalana's persistence for years. When the DNA result came through, she didn't hesitate. She assigned her best cold case investigator, Detective Todd Kenner, to the case full-time. Kenner looked at what they had. A confirmed murder, a skull with forensic evidence of a violent, premeditated death, a victim whose own diary had named the only person with a motive, and a primary suspect who had been living freely for years. It was a strong foundation. But foundation alone doesn't convict anyone. They needed something that would hold up in front of a jury, a direct link between Bill Major and the murder of his wife. Physical evidence was gone. No body, no car, no weapon. The diary was still inadmissible hearsay. And then Detective Kenner found out about the phone call. In 1996, while Bill was being held in Boone County Jail on the Kentucky child molestation charges, he had made a phone call to his father, James Major, and during that call, Bill had confessed. According to James, Bill told him everything, that he had killed Marlene, that he had shot her, that he had disposed of her body and her car. James Major, a retired trucker who had spent years quietly carrying what his son had told him, had gone to investigators as soon as he found out the case was being reopened. He was done protecting a secret he had never wanted to carry. He sat across from detectives and told them exactly what his son had said. Kenner leaned forward. This was it. A direct confession from the killer's own mouth, reported by the killer's own father. Then came the problem. Boone County Jail recorded inmate phone calls. But for reasons that investigators could never fully explain, that particular call, that specific conversation in 1996, had not been recorded. There was no tape, no transcript, no audio. Nothing but an old man's memory of a conversation that had happened years ago, and James Major, despite his willingness to cooperate, was not a neutral witness. There was serious, documented hostility between him and Bill. Any defense attorney worth their fee would tear that testimony apart in front of a jury. An unrecorded confession reported by an estranged father who despised his son. It wasn't enough. Not alone. Bill had confessed. His own father had heard every word. But without a recording, it meant nothing in a court of law. They had one shot left, and it required James Major to do something that took more courage than most people will ever be asked to show. They needed him to call his son again, this time with a wire. Detective Kenner had one move left, and it depended entirely on a retired trucker living in Nova Scotia, Canada, a man in his 70s who hated his son with every fiber of his being and had been waiting years for someone to finally ask him for help. Kenner and Detective Tim Carnahan packed their bags and flew to Nova Scotia. James Major met them at his home. He was cooperative from the first conversation. No hesitation, no conditions. He had already told investigators what Bill had confessed to him in 1996. He already knew that confession couldn't be used, and when detectives explained what they needed him to do, call his son again with a recording device on the phone and get him talking, James didn't flinch. He agreed immediately. He even suggested his own cover story. He would tell Bill he didn't have long to live, that he was sick, that he was calling because he needed to settle things before he died. It was the kind of story that might lower Bill's guard, make him feel like the conversation was private, emotional, final. Detectives set up the recording equipment. James picked up the phone, and they waited to see if 20 years of silence was finally about to break. Bill answered. The first few minutes were careful, measured. Bill was pleasant on the surface, the way charming people are when they haven't yet decided whether to trust a situation. And then, almost immediately, he said it. "Why do I get the feeling that somebody's trying to set me up?" The room went still. Kenner didn't move. James stayed calm. He pushed back gently, told Bill he was overthinking it, said he was just an old man who wanted to talk to his son, that Lalana kept calling him, asking about Marlene, and he didn't know what to tell her anymore. Bill was quiet for a moment. Then he kept talking. James steered the conversation carefully. He told Bill that Lalana just wanted to know where her mother was. She wanted to be able to put Marlene's bones in a casket and have a proper burial. That was all. Just closure for a daughter who had spent her whole life not knowing. Bill's response came without a pause. "Yeah, and put me in jail for life." In the room with the recording equipment, Kenner looked at Carnahan. There it was. Not a denial. Not, "I don't know what happened to Marlene." Not, "I had nothing to do with it." Bill had just responded to the question of his wife's burial location by calculating his own prison sentence. The logic of a guilty man, spoken out loud, on tape, without realizing what he had just handed them. James kept going. He pushed gently on the edges of what Bill had told him in 1996. He referenced the confession without naming it directly. He told Bill that at the very least he could be decent enough to say where he had left her. Bill's answers stayed evasive, but they stayed revealing. And then she's going to bounce it right back on me again. Then I'll have them Kentucky cops coming up here to arrest me. He was negotiating the consequences of telling the truth, which meant he knew the truth, which meant there was a truth to know. James tried another angle. You have pulled off the perfect crime, haven't you? Bill paused. No, I wouldn't call it perfect. No? If the crime was perfect, nobody would ever know about it. James let that sit for a moment. Then he asked the only question that really mattered. Don't you even feel bad for killing her? The answer came back flat, empty, with no more emotion than someone answering a question about the weather. I don't have any kind of conscience about anything. Kenner exhaled slowly. That was it. That was the line. Not a technical confession, not I killed her on this date with this weapon, but something in some ways more damning. A man who had just been asked if he felt remorse for killing his wife and had answered with a calm, almost bored admission that he felt nothing, about anything. Kenner looked at Carnahan. We got him. The arrest came on June 25, 2001. Detectives flew to Fairhaven, Massachusetts, where Bill had been living with his third wife, a woman named Claire Bailey, a bus monitor who believed her husband had gone to prison years ago for armed robbery. She had no idea who she had married. Officers knocked on the door of the house in Fairhaven. Bill Major, now 57 years old, opened it. He was served with an arrest warrant for the first-degree murder of Helen Marlene Major, a crime committed 21 years earlier in a small Kentucky town that he thought he had left behind forever. He was handcuffed on his own doorstep. And then something unexpected happened. On the drive back to Kentucky, hours in the back of a police car, crossing state lines, heading toward the place where everything had started, Bill Major started talking. Nobody asked him to. Nobody pushed. He simply began, as if something had loosened inside him now that the pretense was finally over. He told detectives his version of the night of October 11th, 1980. He said they had been arguing in Marlene's car, her 1972 Ford Pinto, parked outside the trailer. The fight had escalated, voices rising, the air inside the car getting tighter. Marlene told him she was leaving, that she was taking the children, that if he didn't sign the divorce papers and let her go, she was going to tell everyone, his family, the courts, anyone who would listen, exactly what he had been doing to Donald. Bill said she pulled a gun on him. He said he took it away from her, and then she started screaming, loud, uncontrolled, the kind of screaming that meant everything was coming apart, and he said that was when he lost it. He fired until the gun was empty. 6 shots, 4 in the torso, 2 in the face, and then, and this is the part that detectives noted carefully in their reports, Bill told them he was proud of his grouping, all 6 bullet holes within a 10-inch diameter. He described it like a man talking about a target at a shooting range, tight, controlled, precise. He had just murdered his wife, and his first thought was pride. After the shooting, he left Marlene's body in the Pinto. He drove to the neighbor's house, Trini Bryce, and dropped off the children, told them he'd be back in a few hours. Then he returned to the car. He drove the Pinto to the Waller farm, a property where he had worked occasionally, land he knew well, land with a sinkhole deep enough to swallow a body. He carried Marlene there. He placed her in the sinkhole. He covered it with dirt. Then he took a piece of rolled fencing from the property and laid it over the top. He tossed the murder weapon into a nearby pond. Then he drove the Pinto to the Ohio River and pushed it in. The car went under. The crime scene went with it. He went home, woke his children, and told them their mother had run away. Investigators searched the Waller farm. They searched the pond. They searched the stretch of the Ohio River where the Pinto had gone in. They used boats. They used an airplane to scan the water from above. They found nothing. No car, no weapon, no remaining bones. The only piece of Marlene Major that had ever surfaced was the skull found by a hunter in 1981, and even that had taken 20 years of science catching up to identify. But they didn't need the car. They didn't need the weapon. They had the DNA. They had the forensic evidence of homicide. They had the recorded phone call. And now they had a confession, spoken freely in the back of a police car by a man who told them he felt no remorse. For the first time in 21 years, the state of Kentucky had everything it needed. William Alexander Major was going to trial, and 2 children who had spent their entire lives being told their mother had abandoned them were finally going to get the chance to tell the truth. July 2003, Boone Circuit Court, Burlington, Kentucky. 23 years after Marlene Major vanished into the dark, the man who put her there was finally sitting in a courtroom. He looked nothing like the man in the old photographs. The dark hair was gone. The sharp eyes were sunken. Bill Major was 59 years old, and he looked older than that, weathered in the specific way that guilt and prison and a 1995 stroke will weather a person. He arrived in a wheelchair. His defense team had made sure of that. A sick old man in a wheelchair reads differently to a jury than a calculated killer who had spent 2 decades living freely while his children carried the wreckage he had made of their lives. But Lalana knew exactly who was sitting in that chair. He had known since she was 4 years old. The prosecution built the case piece by piece. The jury heard about the night of October 11th, 1980, the argument, the Ford Pinto, the 6 shots fired in the dark. They heard the forensic testimony of Dr. Gring, Emily Craig, who walked them through every cut mark on that skull, every deliberate incision, every sign of a killer who had worked methodically to make his wife unidentifiable. They heard the recorded phone call. Bill's own voice, flat and unbothered, telling his father he had no conscience about anything. They heard from Glenn St. Hilaire, who told the court that Bill had not just encouraged the affair, he had engineered it, had manufactured every situation that pushed Glenn and Marlene together, and Glenn told them something else, something he had never forgotten. Bill had told him directly, before Marlene disappeared, that if she ever tried to leave and take the children, he would shoot her, cut off her head, and knock out her teeth so no one could ever identify her body. Had described his plan out loud, to another person, before he carried it out. That is not a man who lost control in a moment of passion. That is a man who had already decided. Then Donald took the stand. He was 30 years old. He had spent more than 2 decades trying to build a life from the ruins of the one his father had created. He sat in that witness box and told the court what Bill had done to him. In the trailer, in the truck, in the warehouse, at work, wherever. He said those words plainly, without drama, without looking away. Then Lalana took the stand. She told the jury about the gun pressed to her face, about the threat that had kept her silent for years. About the morning she read her mother's diary for the first time and understood that Marlene had known everything, had been fighting to protect her children while quietly documenting every piece of evidence she would need to escape. The courtroom was very quiet while Lalana spoke. The defense had one argument. Bill's attorney, Edward Drennan, told the jury that the 1995 stroke had affected Bill's memory and judgment, that the confession in the police car was the confused rambling of a brain-damaged man, not a reliable account. He argued that whatever happened between Bill and Marlene that night was driven by emotional distress, that Bill had been pushed to a breaking point by jealousy and a crumbling marriage. Extreme emotional distress, that was the phrase. The same man who had told a friend exactly how he would destroy his wife's body before he did it. The same man who, when asked if he felt bad for killing her, had said he had no conscience about anything. That man, his attorney argued, had simply been under too much emotional pressure. After Drennan finished his closing argument, Bill leaned over and complimented him on a job well done. Then he turned his wheelchair to face the gallery, and he smiled at his children, not with warmth, not with regret, with the same cold, deliberate expression Lalana had seen in that Rhode Island hallway 19 years earlier. The smile of a man who still believed he was in control. He was wrong. The jury left to deliberate. Lalana and Donald sat in the gallery and waited. Every minute stretched. Every sound from the hallway made them look up. 43 minutes later, the jury came back. 43 minutes. For a murder committed in 1980. For a case that had been cold for 2 decades. For a woman who had been reduced to a single partial skull in a forensic lab while her killer raised her children and built new lives and smiled at people who had no idea who he really was. 43 minutes. The verdict was read aloud. Guilty. Donald leaned over to his sister and said 4 words. It's finally over. Lalana felt her brother's hand on her arm, and she nearly collapsed. Not from grief, from the weight of everything that had finally been set down. 20 years of notebooks and phone calls and closed doors, and a father who had laughed at her. 20 years of being the daughter of a woman everyone said had abandoned her family. All of it, in 43 minutes, had been overturned. She stood up in that courtroom and said goodbye to her father. Goodbye, Dad. I hope you spend the rest of your life behind bars. You deserve it. Bill was sentenced to life in prison and transported to Kentucky State Reformatory in LaGrange. But he wasn't done fighting. In 2005, he filed an appeal and won a retrial. His legal team argued on multiple grounds: the admissibility of the recorded call, the introduction of his prior crimes, prosecutorial conduct. The Kentucky Supreme Court granted the retrial. The second jury deliberated and came back with the same verdict. Guilty. Same sentence. Life. In 2009, Bill filed a second appeal. The court reviewed his arguments and denied it. Every door he tried to open stayed shut. William Alexander Major, the man who had told his children their mother was a drug addict, who didn't love them, who had pressed a gun to his daughter's face to buy her silence, who had smiled from a wheelchair at the children he had broken, was going to die in a Kentucky prison. And on October 15, 2017, that is exactly what happened. Bill Major died in custody at the age of 73. No obituary, no public mourning, no record of anyone marking his passing with anything other than relief. Marlene was buried. Not all of her, the rest of her remains were never found. The Waller Farm sinkhole gave nothing back. The Ohio River kept the Pinto. The pond held the gun. But the skull that had sat in a forensic lab for 20 years, identified finally by the DNA of the daughter who refused to give up, that was laid to rest. Marlene's mother, Lorraine, stood at the graveside and later told a reporter what those 20 years had felt like. You just couldn't believe how hard it was for us to know our daughter's skull was sitting in a forensic lab somewhere for all those years. The headstone reads Marlene Oaks, her maiden name, the name she was born with. The name she had before Bill Major entered her life when she was 16 years old and slowly dismantled everything she was. Here is what is true about Marlene Major. She was not a drug addict. She was not an alcoholic. She was not a woman who walked away from her children. She was a 25-year-old mother who discovered something horrifying happening inside her own home and made the decision to stop it. She gathered her evidence quietly. She made her plan carefully. She told the people she trusted. She was ready to leave. And Bill knew it. He killed her not in a moment of uncontrolled rage. He killed her because she was about to expose him, because she was smarter than he had counted on, because she had spent months building a case against him from the inside, and he had run out of time to stop her any other way. She died protecting her children. She died so that Donald and Lalana would have a chance at a life away from the man who had been destroying them both. She was right about one thing she wrote in that diary. No judge would have given Bill custody of those children once the truth came out. The truth did come out. It just took 23 years. And it took a daughter who bought a 99-cent notebook and refused, through fear and silence and dead ends, and a father who laughed at her, to stop writing in it. Marlene Oaks was buried on a September afternoon, 23 years after the night she disappeared. She was finally at peace, and the little girl she died trying to protect had made sure of it. Before you go, I want to ask you 3 things. If Marlene had lived and escaped that night, how different would the lives of her children have been? Lalana spent years fighting for justice with nothing but a 99-cent notebook. What does that tell you about what one person can accomplish when they simply refuse to quit? And finally, do you think Bill Major ever truly understood what he had taken from the world? Or did he go to his grave believing he had won? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one.